I'd like to welcome all our attendees. My name is Jim Herbsleb. I'm Director of the Institute for Software Research here at CMU, and I've been here almost 19 years now. My own areas of research are collaboration and coordination in software engineering. But here, we're here to talk about a couple of new faculty members. This is the fourth event in the SCS New Faculty Introduction Series. And the purpose of the series is just to introduce the SCS community to some of the newest faculty members. And we encourage you to participate at any time by asking questions via the Q&A function. And we'll try to get to those live as we move on. So I'd like to introduce Vincent Helendorn, who is coming to us from the University of California, Davis. He's a newbie, he's an assistant professor. He just started with us last fall. His main area of research is using AI to enhance software engineering environments. And I'd also like to introduce Dominik Moritz. He comes to us from University of Washington. He also is an assistant professor who just started this year. And his main area of research is designing and building interactive systems for visualization and analysis. So next thing up on the agenda, we'll have a couple of pre-recorded videos to take you a little bit deeper into Dominik and Vincent's research.
Hi, my name is Vincent Pelendorn. I'm a recent assistant professor at the ISR Department in Software Engineering Research at the School of Computer Science. My research is all about the intersection of machine learning and software engineering. So let me explain what that means. Right now, there's about 27 million developers in the world. That's 3% of the entire world population writing software. And those developers are producing some 10 billion words of code per day, every day. That's more than the volume of Wikipedia. And so where this code used to be more of a, very machine, very low level, requires experts to write every character and very hard to parse. But that's not at all the reality anymore today. These days, code is written often collaboratively with lots of interaction between peers in development environments that come with a lot of help and sort of helping you avoid bugs and writing the code better and better. And the code itself has totally changed. It's documented. It's got highlighting. It's self-explanatory in many different ways. And so the point is that programming is a human discipline. People write code, and they write code in ways that they can read it and that other people can read it, and this helps them write better code and helps these code bases grow to billions of tokens a day. It is also very tedious, and mistakes can be extremely costly. When bugs are detected, they can sometimes cost millions or billions of dollars and affect people all over the world, more and more so as more people write code. Machine learning excels at such human tasks. We've seen in recent years that deep learning and artificial intelligence models are succeeding at image recognition and writing natural language and reading documents. And they also work very well for code. They can help us automate these tedious parts. They can help catch bugs. They can help generate code. And so they can be very useful in the software development process. But to really help people, you need human insights, right? To actually build models that can do a good job at supporting developers, that can find the right bugs and not interfere with the workflow too much, requires domain expertise in both machine learning and software engineering. And that is all what my research is all about. So for one, I work in machine learning where I improve models specifically for code, but also in general. And so these models can learn to read and write better software. And they are starting to excel at finding bugs and repairing bugs automatically, which can be very useful. This was work done at Google, for instance, where this is being used. I work on expanding applications, finding where developers are hitting hiccups and what the tedious parts are that we can automate next, and also how to do that, because this is often very non-trivial. And finally, I work on understanding developers themselves better. So I think in order to make software development accessible to everyone, we need to really get what it means that to write code and what the obstacles are that people are facing. What is the human factor in all this? And so that is a summary of my work. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dominic Moritz. I'm a new professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at CMU. and I co-started the Data Interaction Group, where we help people make sense of data. I'm interested in giving people interactive tools to explore and understand data more effectively. Here's an example. It's a basic visualization type, a scatter plot. And it's actually an homage to Hans Rosling, who gave a famous TED talk about this data set. What it shows is data for different countries, namely the life expectancy on Y and fertility, which is the number of children per woman, on the x-axis. And so this data shows us where different countries from different regions in the world fall on this chart in 1955. We can get additional data through interactions. By hovering over a point, we can see the country and the trajectory it took throughout the years. We can then also change the year, so see how these countries are developing throughout time and move towards later time, where you can see that most countries are moving towards the upper left, but there's also outliers like Rwanda that you just saw there. And so you can see how these countries move through time and how they developed in tandem, how they were similar or different. Through a combination of this visual encodings and interactions, we can get more insights into this data set. So what I do in my research is create new visualization languages to make interactive visualizations like this one possible. In fact, here's a screenshot of the very visualization you just saw in an online editor that we created. The languages my colleague and I created is called Vega Lite. It has won awards at academic conferences and is used by companies and the data science community. And it currently has 2 million monthly downloads from CDN. But I don't just want to make tools that allow people to make visualizations, because only a well-designed visualization empowers people to understand data effectively. Here's an example. It's a data set that shows barley yields for 2 different years. And I would argue it's really difficult to see what really is happening with this data and how these different sites are, how the yield is changing for different years. So what we can do is create a visualization, and now we can see that in most sites, that the sites seem to have less yield in 1932 compared to 31. But there's still something interesting here that's actually still somewhat hidden. And I wonder whether you can spot it. We can make a small design change and switch to a line mark. And now our powerful perceptual system can kick in and help us spot the outlier, which is the smart side that actually where the yield increased compared to all the other ones where it decreased. And so it's very important to help designers and analysts create effective visual designs and not just give them tools to make visualizations, but actually make visualizations that follow best practices of visual design and data analysis. And so to help analysts and designers do that, I've developed automated design tools that apply best practices to visualization tools. I don't have time to go into it, but I also work on scaling data exploration to large data so that people can work with the data that they have at hand. At the end of the day, ultimately, I'm interested in this question of how do tools help us become better data analysts? So I don't just want to build tools, but I really want to understand how do they help us become better data analysts? And so my research mission and the mission of the lab that I co-founded is to empower everyone to effectively analyze and communicate data. And we do this by designing interactive systems that richly integrate the strengths of both people and machines. And on this mission, we draw on different areas of computer science, including human-computer interaction and visualization, machine learning, such as learning good designs, databases, and programming languages, for instance, domain-specific languages and constraint solvers. If you're curious and want to learn more about our research, you can go to the lab website for the Data Interaction Group. And there you have lists of papers, our research areas, and also links to different members' websites who all work in this group.
All right, that was great. Great, excellent videos. So I want to invite our panelists to unmute themselves, and we can start the Q&A session. I want to remind our attendees that you are welcome to put questions into the Q&A, and we will try to address them as soon as we can. Let me start by asking you about something I'm always really curious about, what it is that inspires a researcher to go into a particular field, a particular domain. Well, so I want to ask you, what inspired you to get involved in the particular flavor of research that you're working on now? Vincent, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, sure. I actually got my my research start in language modeling, and so just kind of natural languages like Dutch and English. My native language is Dutch, and at some point I learned that people were applying this to code, these same kind of models that could capture languages. And this was really intriguing to me because I've always had this belief, learning software engineering at the university undergrad level and beyond. I've always had this belief that programming is too hard. I can learn it because I get years and years, but a lot of people aren't in that position to spend years and years of their lives or don't have access to this kind of rigorous education. And a lot of the reasons programming is hard is because, little typos and poor documentation and whatnot. And so that was kind of what really motivated me, was this idea that we could use intelligent tools to provide an interface between maybe novice programmers and the code they're writing, much like how advanced programming languages are an interface, right, to assembly sort of low-level code. And so I'm still kind of pursuing the same idea of in due course making it so that writing code becomes more an exercise in just regular language expression. And then, the hard, tedious, repetitive parts of code are sort of abstracted.
Great. Thank you. So, Dominic, I'd like to ask you the same question. What inspired you to get involved in research in interactive visualization?
Yeah, for me, visualization was really a tool to make sense of data. And I started using it for visualizing open data. Before I started grad school, I was working at the Open Knowledge Foundation, which is a nonprofit that helps governments publish open data. And so I was working on this platform for publishing open data that many governments around the world use. And one of the parts that we built into it were previews for different kinds of data. And it became really apparent that visualization is both a means to make data more of an experience, easier to understand, but also provides insights that a table just can't provide. And I showed a little bit of that also in my talk.
Absolutely.
And so as I continued, it kind of still remained very challenging to work in this field. So it never got boring. Visualization has elements from human-computer interaction. You have to understand human perception and how we communicate data and so on. But also at the same time, it's hardcore computer science. It's programming languages, it's databases, it's computer graphics, it's statistics. So it remains fun.
Very cool and very timely. I mean, there's so much data available now compared to any time in the past. And to actually extract useful information from that, we need obviously good tools that help us do that. Vincent, I want to go back to something that you just mentioned briefly in the previous question. I think you mentioned that you want to use AI to help kind of transfer software development expertise to non-experts, which is something it's a very lofty ambition, it seems to me, and really a great one. Can you just tell us a little bit about, what's the secret sauce, or how do you do that? How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it actually comes down less to the AI and more to the data. So I work on AI and kind of sort of fundamental progress there, but actually most of my time is spent empirically analyzing code and language and the way people communicate about code, and trying to assess who in these situations are the experts and how are they communicating differently from novices, and what things are they imparting on the people they're communicating to. So Stack Overflow is a good example, right? There's a lot of people answering questions on Stack Overflow, and you can look at what people are saying in the answers versus the questions, and there's different language being used in the two. in the answers, people are talking about concepts and the relations between those concepts, and they're kind of elucidating new patterns that the person in the question might not even have thought to ask. And so this is just one of many sources. I also work with places where there's no natural language, but I'm always working with this data, analyzing the data, and then training models, and then analyzing their outputs to figure out whether they've learned something new or whether they just kind of learn to take shortcuts. So I do some work on interpretability as well, just to kind of make sure that the models aren't, sort of learning very simple patterns and not actually helping us in any way. So it's kind of an end-to-end exercise. It's not just the modeling itself.
Cool. Well, I've got, while we're on this topic, Vincent, let me give you a question from the Q&A from the participants, from Guy Aristoff. So your machine learning based code cleanup will be revolutionary in rapid bug identification and perhaps suggested fixes. I assume you may be able to use training sets from the multitude of code that's written daily to identify common bug typos, as well as statistically significant code lines that are prone to bugs. But how do you catch fundamental functional programming flaws in the logic of the underlying mathematics? Is that even possible?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We certainly, as this field has evolved, we've seen a trend from solving increasing sort of very simple bugs like the wrong name is being used to increasingly hard ones. But what you do see is that as you are broadening out the model scope, it's not so much that the model can't catch these things, but it's that it needs the requisite amount of information to deal with them, right? To figure this out. So if, for instance, there's a comment and there's a mismatch between that comment and the subsequent line, that would be a pretty obvious indicator, but you don't always necessarily have access to that. And so what we're seeing now is that there's more and more models working on the level of entire projects, multiple files or packages, trying to kind of parse whole code bases as opposed to individual functions or literally just lines, which is kind of where we started. And also using data augmentation tricks to kind of like introduce more and more complex bugs as training samples to learn from. But the one caveat here is that as we are working to bigger and bigger scales, AI needs a lot of capacity. And so this is kind of like where you see a bit of a gap between academia and industry. So I work part-time at Google, and there we can like look at massive amounts of code. But here we're kind of also figuring out, okay, how can we scale the models so that we don't have the perpetual compute bottleneck,
Yeah. So what kind of computing equipment do you really need for this, and how expensive is it? And could Alumni potentially help out with that?
Yes, certainly. So usually what we use is graphics accelerators, GPUs, and these, the bigger and bigger models that are currently being trained and created in industry, they often train on anywhere between 32 and 1,000 of these in parallel. And that is definitely capacity that is very easily accessible at Google or at Facebook, but far from so in academia. So this is something I'm actually currently publishing a paper on this topic, kind of like this scaling gap, and the cost of like a 32 216 GPU machines, for instance, runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that is definitely something that we often see scarcity in my lab and related labs too. There's usually one machine with 10 or 8 GPUs, and that's kind of for all the students to share.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a very scarce resource at the moment. All right, so Dominic, let's ask you a question or two here. So you seem very passionate about building tools. And can you tell us about that? What is it you love about building tools? What kind of tools do you want to build? And what's your current most exciting thing you're working on there?
Yeah, I love building tools. I think it's a great way to really engage also with the community of practitioners and understand what are their needs, and also when I build tools and give them to the community, I feel it's very gratifying to see people actually use them. But then also from the academic side, it's great to see when these tools actually get used to build more high level abstractions that then influence some papers. I really think that in order to make progress in science, in computer science, we need good foundations to build on. And those are both mathematical foundations as well as software foundations. It's impossible to do good research on systems if we can't rely on the basic building blocks. And so that's why I like to build these building blocks in the visualization community. So for instance, I've been working with also colleagues at the University of Washington and MIT and a number of companies around the world, and also just individuals on this ecosystem of the Vega tools. I mentioned Vega Lite in my talk and also showed one visualization that we can make with this tool. But really the fascinating part to me about it is that it's not one monolithic tool, but it's actually a stack of different tools that build on each other, where you can go anywhere in that ladder of abstraction and build on it. And in fact, there's, for instance, a Python wrapper, a very popular Python wrapper that a friend of us has built. And it's now more popular on GitHub than Vega Lite itself, but it relies on the underlying infrastructure.
Yeah, great. So let me also ask you, how can alumni support your work?
I think
what's the bottleneck?
Yeah, I think there's three ways in which alumni can help. One is experience, the other one is time, and the last one is funding, as Vincent also mentioned. So for experience, for instance, we're very interested in our lab to study data scientists and their needs. And so we have on our website at dig.cmu.edu a number of studies that students are currently running, where they're talking to data scientists and try to understand their needs, and also show them our prototype tools so we can iterate on them. So that's for expertise. We also would love to have people come to our group meetings that we have once a week, where we discuss papers or we just have short talks from alumni and externals. So please get in touch if you want to come to that. For time, contribute to the open source project if you want to. And for funding, we have lots of ideas, more ideas than we have currently funding for instance, for, in our case, mostly for people, so for undergraduates and masters and PhD students. Yeah, so please get in touch if you want to support the work that we do at the intersection of HCI and data science.
Great, thanks. So, so we have another question from Q&A here, Lauren Ebenhart. I think this is for Vincent. Can you talk more about human bias in coding? Does your work address that problem as well?
Yeah, I've heard this question increasingly in the last year or so, and I think it's time to start taking it, start looking at it more. So most of my work up till this point has really kind of focused on just looking at the code text itself. And so, I wouldn't say it's devoid of biases, but it kind of like, it provides a convenient abstraction to not think about necessarily who produced it. And I think we're kind of reaching the point where that is no longer sustainable, because we're studying more and more, on platforms like GitHub. I'm studying code review now. I've started a project on that in the last 6 months, and there we see major, major artifacts of who is reviewing the code, who is writing the code. There's several studies that demonstrate that factors like gender of the contributor versus the reviewer make a huge difference in how a code is reviewed. And so we're finding that as we're learning from the data that we find there, where people are, we're learning from those reviews, we're seeing these artifacts where, some people do very different reviews from other people and for different code contributions. So I don't have a solution to this yet. I'm working on sort of trying to understand it first empirically. And I think, communicating with colleagues who have more expertise in that. Yu Wang is maybe a great example. She's done some work on this code review, and so that might be a good collaborator in the future. But that's kind of where I'm at right now. That's where we're at.
Okay, so let me just follow up on that a little bit, and ask more generally. What applications for industry do you see coming out of this, either short term, and I know you have work with Google right now, so that's kind of immediate, very short term, and down the road, can you sort of say what impact you think this could have on Google or other companies in their development of software?
Yeah, yeah. I noticed that when you do talk to industrial partners like Google, what they're looking for is any place where there's very long iterations where people are sort of interactively debugging, but because the systems are huge, the build times are very long, so you might get a mistake, you might make a mistake and you only find out 10 minutes later, you have to make a correction, you have to do another 10-minute loop. And so that is really just a fantastic application for AI, because usually the repair itself isn't outrageously complicated. It's just a matter of kind of iterating back and forth with this this system. And so, paradigms like reinforcement learning, but also even fairly conventional machine learners can usually do a good job at, none of these things are as smart as we are, but they can kind of exhaustively, with some intelligence biased, enumerate what possible solutions are and do this iteration for us. And that's what I love. I like to find places where something is really tedious, it's kind of wasting our time, and it doesn't really require the intelligence that developers have, to go back and forth and fix semicolons and whatever. That's not really what coding should be about. And so this is a great example. I think build repair is a prime example of this.
Terrific, terrific. So Dominic, let me ask you the same kind of question. You've have this passion for tools and you've shown us some really cool ones. And I'm kind of wondering what you see as industrial applications of this. I mean, everyone's using data these days. How do you see tools such as the interactive visualizations you're working on changing or transforming industry?
Yeah, I believe they're already doing that. A lot of these visualizations becoming more and more popular for communication, for instance, by newspapers, as well as for understanding data in general tools. I think every machine learning scientist today uses some kind of visualization to understand the model in the whole cycle of development. So starting from the data, looking at it, trying to get a sense for what's even in here, what are the problems, or as Laura was hinting at, potential biases in the data. And visualization can expose that and help expose that. Then when you're actually developing the model, monitoring it, monitoring the development, making sure that the accuracy is actually increasing. Then when we deploy it, monitoring that deployment, making sure that the accuracy stays good, that we don't have shifts of the distributions that invalidate our model. Yeah, and so it's already, the tools that we're building are already being used by Google, Microsoft, Apple, and many others.
Right.
And
the transformation is underway for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Great. So another question from an attendee, it's from Daniel Hoffman. For both of you, who are you most excited to collaborate with at CMU? People, groups, whatever. Dominic, while you got you on the hot seat here, why don't you go ahead and answer that first?
So I already started talking and working with a couple. So for instance, the programming languages group, including Jonathan Aldrich. There's I'm on the committee for one of the students there, and we're looking into ways to find abstractions of visualizations and diagrams. Then I've also recently collaborated with the database group with Andy Pavlo on visualizing ways a self-driving database system works. So this database system automatically optimizes based on the current workload, and we've been looking into ways to visualize how does this model work, how does this work, how does this database work, both to explain it and to monitor it. And then I'm also super interested to work with people in the HCII, of course.
Right, I'm glad you said that, good. Yeah, so Vincent, how about you? Who are you most excited to collaborate with?
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I came to ISR, to CMU, was because there's this great atmosphere of collaboration across many people and departments. And so there are two categories of people I really wanted to work with. One was people who do various kinds of human-computer interaction, either in HCII, like Brad Myers, or Jonathan Aldrich, with whom I'm currently co-advising a student on making sort of translation from sketching to coding, making that more accessible. And the reason is because I have this belief and this vision of programming being increasingly something that, that I think the programming language should increasingly be an interface that makes it easier and easier to write code, even if you don't have that experience. And so I want to understand this human aspect very thoroughly. And then the other thing I've started doing is collaborate with a bunch of people in fields, in parts of software engineering that I'm not terribly well versed in myself, like cyber physical systems with UNSUC, and I'm working with Rohan and various other people in the software engineering group, because I believe that machine learning should be sort of should be applied holistically to software engineering. It should apply to every corner of it, and we should try to understand how we can get those sites to interact. Rather than just, traditionally what it did was mostly code completion and bug detection, kind of a very narrow view, no architecture, no requirements, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to do while I'm here. That's sort of my mission, is to bring AI into all these corners and try to understand how it can support the entire software engineering process. And then I work with a couple of people in machine learning, like Graham Bubick.
I just want to underline that the reason why I came to CMU was just the breadth of expertise here. Like I guess the world expert in X is somewhere down the hall, and that's amazing. So for instance, another one student I'm co-advising right now, she's working with Christos in the computer science department, and we're looking at graph analysis and ways to do data mining on graphs and also visualize to understand, well, what are the patterns we find in those graphs.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me now encourage you to think ahead a little bit more. Think out 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And of course, this is impossible, but I'm going to ask you to do that anyway. It's kind of an interesting exercise to see how you see the world here. So it just doesn't have to be exactly in your research area, but just in general, in either software engineering or in data visualization. What's one prediction you would have for 10 to 20 years from now? What is one thing that's going to be really different, interesting, useful, exciting? How will the world be different for people doing data visualization or people doing software engineering? So Vincent, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, yeah. I think maybe a little optimistic, but I think somewhere in the not too distant future, doing simple programming will be something everyone can do. Just kind of declaring, okay, whenever Tuesday comes around, I do groceries, check everything in the fridge. This is something you can currently not tell that to Siri because it's sort of too complex to do that. But you can, as a programmer, I could specify a routine and implement sensors and put everything in place, and then that would be a huge program. I think that gap is going to shrink and shrink and shrink, and up to the point where sort of intelligent assistants can basically take your instructions and convert them into programs and allow people to do programming in their everyday lives. Sort of everything they can explain reasonably well, which is all that programming is, right? We just explain something to a compiler which understands nothing. There's going to be a point where anything you can explain fairly well can be automated and turned into code. And if you can read the code, great. But if not, it's still going to do the thing you want, right? So I think that's kind of what's going to happen, is intelligent assistants to the point of implementing entire routines and programs, what currently requires some professional degree to do.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. I look forward to that day also. Of course, what do we do with programming classes? I don't know. We won't have to teach them anymore, I guess. So let me ask the same question of you, Dominic. What do you see in data visualization 10 or 20 years down the road?
Yeah, I love Vincent's answer, and I'm giving a somewhat similar answer here. Maybe with a slightly more negative starting point, which is that data is everywhere now, and it's often taken away from us. It's often been used by people who don't want to use that data. But I'm very hopeful for the future that we'll be able to own more of our data, and hopefully also then be able to make sense of it. And that's, I think, where visualization can come in. That people can make visualizations of their own data on their own devices without having to go to, for instance, the cloud, and be more informed citizens, be the owners of their own data and of their own decisions. I think visualization can enable that going forward.
Yeah, cool, very cool. All right, great. both of you have outlined a future that I would like to see, looking forward to. Okay, so let me switch gears a little bit here. And as you know, CMU in lots of places, but here definitely at CMU, we've been working hard to try to make the university a more diverse place. We've had some notable successes in the undergraduate computer science program, for example. New students being admitted to that are 50% male, 50% female. So we've got some very good gender diversity there, gender balance. Other areas we're maybe not doing as well. But what I'm wondering from you is, how do you see yourself contributing to the efforts to make the university more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive? And do you have any recommendations about that or relevant experiences that you'd like to share? Dominic, you want to go first?
Yeah, it's something that's very dear to my heart, and was also one of the points why I really love the HCI and CMU in general. People really care about creating an equitable future, and I think we still have a very long way to go. There's huge inequalities in the world. We still have hate crimes, just like the one that just happened a couple of days ago in Atlanta. And yeah, I think it's our obligation to create a non-racist future. And so the part I think that universities can play here is to make sure that we're educating people on these topics, make sure that we're creating places in every class about issues of inequality. So for instance, in the class that I was teaching last semester on interactive data science, we had a dedicated lecture about the ethics of data. Think about where does the data come from? What were the intentions of the person who created that data? And what are you doing with that data? Are you making sure that it is going to interpret it in the correct ways? And so I think that's, as educators, that's our obligation to do that. And then on the other side, it's important to make sure that we hire people with diverse backgrounds who really enrich our community. And I think here it's our obligation to put in the effort to create, to hire diversely and really look into what each candidate can contribute. It's often very easy to look at these kind of high-level signals of number of publications or prestigious school, but what are the other things we can look for? And it's more work, but I think we have to put in that work.
Great. All right, thanks, Dominic. Vincent, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I want to second Dominic's earlier statement that I think this is something I really appreciate about CMU, especially, not just that this is work in progress, but also that there is a very sort of strong open mindset about continuing this and improving things over time. I often come back to kind of, what can I do from sort of my research, like my perspective. And one of the things I'm becoming more and more passionate about is education, and specifically programming teaching, where I think there's sort of a gap in where you're coming from in your background, as entering the undergraduate programs, where some people have already had a lot of exposure to computer science, and so they're more likely to get accepted and more likely to succeed. And a lot of this is, in my mind, comes down to these same things, these same ideas of like, do you have access to that time and that those resources and mentors and that kind of thing. And so I'm sort of studying, I'm sort of looking more and more, I had a paper this year, but I'm more and more looking into, can we automate programming teaching feedback so that people can self-teach to program, but have some notion of an intelligent tutor that provides them that signal that otherwise, that you really only get from a teacher right now. So right now you have to go to a school and there is a teacher, and like CMU has maybe, a tiny percentage of all the people who would like to learn, and we also have all the best professors, and that seems really sort of unfair to me. And so I'm looking into ways to get intelligent program assistants into the hands of students, especially undergraduate or even high school students, in order to get them that kind of feedback so that they can learn to program without just a compiler saying you're missing a semicolon, I don't know where, you know, kind of moving this to a higher level so that that is more accessible.
Yeah, great answers. I think I should also mention that both HCII and ISR have thriving programs on research experiences for undergraduates, and many of our faculty and graduate students mentor students. The students for these, this is a summer program for promising undergraduates, and the selection is generally based on students who we think can benefit from this kind of experience, and often who don't have opportunities at their home institutions to get involved in research. And that's been a very effective program at bringing a much more diverse bunch of students to CMU to work, at least for the summer, with all of us. And we've been recruiting PhD students from this program as well. So, and many of our faculty and students participate that. And I think it's great. People invest a lot of time and energy in this, and it's a fantastic program. All right, so let's see, what else can we talk about here? There's so many things could ask you about your research. Here's a question that is a little bit different. If someone were to visit your lab, talk to your students, look at your visualizations, or look at your AI and enhanced coding environments, what's something that a visitor might be surprised to see or surprised to learn about what you're doing? Anything? Dominic?
Yeah, I think one is that the visualizations that we make, they're not necessarily all that they don't have to be that complicated. And I think that's actually a really important feature. It's not really that important to create visualizations that are complicated and overwhelming and oppressive, but use the basic visualization building blocks that we have of bar charts, line charts, scatter plot, but combine them in new ways to fit new opportunities. And I'm quoting here directly from a paper from John Tukey from the 1960s, who said that our primary task, I'm quoting roughly here, is not to invent wholly new techniques, although those are needed, but to kind of recognize the essential of existing techniques and combine them in new ways to fit new opportunities. So that might be a little bit surprising.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, do you see ways that we could incorporate, more sophistication in how to use basic visualizations in education in the classroom? I mean, have you run into that? Have you thought about that as a improvement that we could make?
Absolutely. I showed these visualization recommendation tools briefly in my talk. The idea there is to take the basic building blocks, the basic visualizations that we have, and make it easier to create those visualizations by encoding best practices and automated design in an AI system, so that as a visualization author, you only provide things like, here's the data and here's some basic building blocks, some basic parts of the visualization that I want. I want a visualization of these two variables, and I want to see the correlation between them. Mm-hmm. And the system can help make that visualization that realizes that, for instance, a scatter plot, and it does so faster than I would be if I were to code it by hand. And it also helps me learn what a best practice is. And so I think these automated design tools can really help in an education context by surfacing potential issues with a visualization that could be biasing you towards seeing something that's not in the data, and also making it faster.
Yeah, cool, great, thank you. So let me ask the same question of you, Vincent. What might a visitor be surprised to see or learn hanging out with you and your students in your research tasks?
I would say probably the amount of manual analysis we do, which seems a bit odd, right? We have these massive data mining. I use a lot of data mining and whatnot, and machine learning, but it's just really crucial to me that everything we do is grounded in a deep understanding of what's going on. So whenever my students and I tackle a new domain like question answering on Stack Overflow or reviewing on GitHub or whatnot, I really want us to look at, hundreds or even thousands of samples, create labelings and then go back and figure out whether the labelings are adequate, train models, and then analyze whether they're predicting. And this inspection, kind of this really rigorous inspection effort of looking at lots and lots of things, gives us the exposure to kind of get into the shoes of the developers who are working there or asking there or answering there. And it seems like the insights you get out of this are just they're irreplaceable. It doesn't matter how accurately you train a machine learner. You often see papers report magic numbers like 80% accuracy, but then the actual usefulness of it may not be there at all. And I've shown that in papers, that if you look at the data, the usefulness isn't there. People aren't responding to them the way you thought. And so I just love that, kind of getting into the shoes of developers, understanding their environment. I really care about sort of my students learning high quality software engineering so that we can connect and, doing internships as part of that, ideally, if they want, so that we can connect to developers where they are. I think that's a very important skill.
Yeah, great. All right, one final question. Let's fast forward 9 years. We have a long tenure clock here, so we're looking at 9 years. Fast forward 9 years ahead. You're now tenured. And so you can sort of sit back and relax and do anything you want, although people don't sit back and relax. They usually keep chugging along as vigorously as they have before. But do you see yourself maybe thinking about changing directions or trying something that's really high risk, or trying something new, trying something different? What kind of thoughts have you had about if you had total freedom, what would you do next?
I would do nothing different. I think it's actually the long tenure clock really, in a way, makes it that tenure is so far away that if I were to try to optimize just for that, I think, potentially have a miserable time for 10 years. So I think it's important to already take risks, and I can do that because of the long tenure clock. Already do what I think is important, and because if I wait until 10 years to work on what I think is important, I think it would be too late. So yeah, I hope that the stuff that I do is, if it's important and if it's successful, that I will get tenure. And so I don't really want to change anything, and I hope nothing changes.
I think that's a great answer. I think that that's kind of the way I look at it. Many people do. Sometimes we're asked about why such a long tenure clock. In a way, it's a positive. It gives you lots of time to try different things, and some of them work, some of them don't. You got a lot of time to, to establish yourself. But Vincent, have you had thoughts about, maybe it's too far ahead to think, but have you had thoughts about you might want to try something different or try your hand at a different research area?
Yeah, I think sort of the most sort of ambitious, potentially very low payoff thing that always comes to my mind is neuro-symbolic AI. And what I mean by that is, like, I believe that AI and software and programming are two sides of the same coin. They're both learning functions. They're both based on data. And right now they're like, the way we create them is totally sort of polar opposites, right? One of them, we have a black box and gradient descent, and we have no real, increasingly more, but still not really any real idea of what's happening or whatnot. And then coding is like extremely static. You have to satisfy all constraints, and the moment an input doesn't match your expected input domain, everything goes haywire. So you can never write a program that recognizes a bird, right? But you can easily train an AI for it. And I think that's kind of like, I think that's sort of silly. Like, the AI is also learning a function, and we have constructed very large programs. And there's sort of this whole domain that I think we can currently call it neuro-symbolic AI, but it will no doubt have a different name in 5 to 10 years, where we're trying to study, can we have AI that can reason about logic and propositions, and sort of, causal reasoning is also becoming more and more of a factor. And I really love that. I think there's something fascinating there. So I probably would spend, I like what I do right now, and I don't think it would be to the exclusion of that, but I think in 9 years, I probably want to spend more time on that, if the right student comes around to understand whether we can start synthesizing complex programs that are still readable and you code, that can do these things.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Exciting. That is really an exciting future. I hope you get a chance to do that. I think you we'll have plenty of opportunities for both of you here at CMU. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and as we wrap up the program for today, I'd like to thank the panelists for coming out and answering questions, telling us a little bit about your research. It's been absolutely fascinating. I want to thank the attendees for joining us today, and let the audience know that we'll follow up with the recording of this once we have it captioned and edited, and it'll be available for viewing. And that concludes our program for today. Thank you.